The streets of Brooklyn Heights pulsed with life, a symphony of honking cars, distant sirens, and the rhythmic chatter of pedestrians forming the city's natural soundtrack. Mike Tyson, a towering presence in his casual hoodie and jeans, walked with a quiet confidence, his legendary physique evident even beneath the fabric. The late afternoon sun bathed the streets in a golden glow, but Mike's mind was on one thing: food. The scent of sizzling meat and grilled onions drifted through the air, guiding him toward a bustling food truck at the corner of Fulton Street. The vendor, a wiry old man with a Yankees cap, nodded in recognition. "Mike, didn't expect to see you here," he said with a grin. Mike smirked, just craving a real New York hot dog. As he stepped into line, a few heads turned, whispers rippling through the crowd. Some recognized him immediately, while others only sensed an aura of undeniable power. Despite the stares, Mike remained relaxed, his focus on the menu. The sizzle of the grill, the clinking of metal utensils, the casual laughter of strangers. It was a rare, peaceful moment. But then the air shifted. A low, rumbling growl of motorcycles rolled down the street, drowning out the city's hum. An unspoken tension spread through the crowd as the deafening roar grew closer. Mike didn't need to turn around. He could feel it in his bones. Trouble was coming. The rhythmic roar of motorcycles thundered down Fulton Street, drowning out the chatter of the city. The pavement seemed to tremble beneath the sheer power of the approaching gang, their chrome-plated machines gleaming under the afternoon sun. Mike Tyson, still holding his freshly unwrapped hot dog, exhaled slowly. He didn't turn around. He didn't need to. He could already sense the predatory energy in the air. The food vendor, who just moments ago had been grinning, suddenly looked uneasy. "Man, that don't sound good," he muttered, his eyes darting toward the street. Then, like a pack of wolves, descending on unsuspecting prey, they arrived. A half-dozen leather-clad bikers, their jackets emblazoned with a snarling wolf surrounded by iron chains, skidded to a stop in front of the food truck. The leader, a grizzled brute with a jagged scar running from his temple down to his jaw, swung a thick leg over his bike and stepped forward. His piercing stare locked onto Mike. The tension was immediate, electric. Conversations died. Pedestrians instinctively moved away, avoiding eye contact, pretending they weren't witnessing what was about to unfold. Scarface, a name whispered in fear throughout the back streets of Brooklyn, smirked, his lips curling like a snake ready to strike. "Didn't know they were serving hot dogs to just anybody these days," he sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. His gang chuckled, the sound low and guttural, like a pack of hyenas scenting blood. Mike finally turned, his expression unreadable. He took a slow bite of his hot dog, chewing deliberately, his posture relaxed. But his eyes? His eyes were razor sharp, reading every muscle twitch, every subtle movement of the gang. Scarface's smirk faltered for half a second, just long enough for Mike to see it. Fear, doubt. But the biker quickly masked it with bravado. "Oh, you heard me, huh?" Scarface taunted, stepping closer. "And you don't care?" Mike swallowed, wiped his mouth with a napkin, and tossed it into the trash. His calm, controlled movements only seemed to agitate Scarface further. "I heard you," Mike said, his voice steady, deep, commanding. "And I don't care." He tilted his head slightly. "What I do care about? You and your boys blocking the sidewalk, making it hard for people to get their food." The bikers erupted in laughter, but there was a nervous edge to it. Something about Mike's absolute lack of fear unsettled them. Scarface's expression darkened. He wasn't used to being ignored. He wasn't used to anyone, let alone one man, standing in his way. His fingers twitched toward his belt, where a heavy steel chain hung like a serpent waiting to be unleashed. The crowd held its breath. The vendor took a cautious step back. And Mike? He simply exhaled, rolling his shoulders loose, his movements almost lazy. But his stance shifted ever so slightly, the kind of shift only trained fighters recognize. This wasn't going to end in words. It was about to get physical. What happens next? Does Scarface really think he can intimidate Mike Tyson? Will he regret the biggest mistake of his life? Drop it in the comments if you want to see what happens next. Like this video if you love action-packed stories, subscribe and turn on notifications, because trust me, you won't want to miss part 2. The air between Mike Tyson and Scarface was thick with unspoken violence, a storm waiting to break. The bikers shifted restlessly, their fingers twitching over chains, knives, and brass knuckles, eager for the fight they thought would be over in seconds. Scarface, emboldened by the presence of his gang, took another step forward, his boots scuffing against the pavement. "You got a real smart mouth, old man," he sneered, tilting his head like a predator toying with its prey. "You think you're tough?" Mike didn't answer. He didn't need to. The way he stood, the way he breathed, even the way he blinked, all of it spoke of a man who had nothing to prove but was ready to unleash hell if pushed. Scarface's face twisted in irritation at Mike's silence. He was used to fear. He was used to people begging, apologizing, backing down. But Mike just stood there, unshaken, unimpressed. The tension snapped. Scarface's fist shot forward like a piston, aiming straight for Mike's face. It was the kind of punch that had left plenty of men unconscious before they hit the ground. But it never landed. In a flash, Mike moved. His head slipped just inches to the side, the wind from Scarface's punch brushing against his ear. Before the biker could recover, Mike's counterstrike came like a thunderbolt, his elbow hammering into Scarface's ribs. The sound was sickening, a deep, wet crunch. Scarface's breath left his lungs in a painful wheeze, his body folding inward as if someone had driven a sledgehammer into his side. He staggered back, eyes wide with shock. The other bikers froze. For the first time, fear replaced their arrogance. Scarface, the man they followed, the man they feared, had just been dropped in less than a second. But the leader was too enraged to back down. Gritting his teeth, he lunged again, this time reaching for the chain at his belt. With a wild growl, he swung it toward Mike's face, the heavy steel links cutting through the air with lethal speed. Mike caught it mid-swing, effortlessly. The crowd gasped. Scarface's eyes widened. Before he could react, Mike yanked the chain forward, pulling Scarface off balance, and in the same motion, he drove his fist into Scarface's jaw. The biker's body went limp before he even hit the pavement. Silence. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then, the gang snapped out of their shock. One of the bikers, a wiry man with brass knuckles, rushed in, swinging for Mike's temple. Mike dipped low, the strike whistling through empty air. His counter was instantaneous, a brutal uppercut to the gut. The biker's feet lifted off the ground from the sheer force of the impact before he collapsed, gasping for breath. The rest of the gang moved as one, fueled by blind aggression. But it didn't matter. Mike was faster. He was stronger. And most importantly, he had been built for this. They just didn't know it yet. Scarface's body hit the pavement hard, his head bouncing off the concrete with a dull thud. His gang, once cocky and arrogant, now hesitated, watching their leader groan in pain, dazed, and struggling to even sit up. But hesitation quickly turned to rage. A hulking biker with a chain lunged at Mike Tyson, swinging wildly, his eyes burning with fury. Big mistake. Mike snatched the chain midair and yanked hard, sending the thug sprawling forward. With terrifying precision, Mike drove his knee into the biker's chest, the force lifting the man off his feet before he crashed onto his back, gasping for air. Another biker, brass knuckles gleaming in the sunlight, charged in, throwing a wild haymaker aimed for Mike's head. But Mike was a ghost, slipping just inches out of reach. Then he struck. A devastating left hook to the ribs, followed by a blinding fast uppercut to the jaw. The biker's feet left the ground, his body collapsing like a puppet with its strings cut. The gang saw their numbers dropping fast. Desperation kicked in. 2 men attacked at once, one wielding a bat, the other with a switchblade flashing in the afternoon sun. The one with the bat swung for Mike's head, but he ducked, fluid like water. In the same motion, he caught the biker's wrist and twisted, forcing the bat from his grasp. Then, with a bone-crushing backhand strike, Mike sent him tumbling into the sidewalk. The knife-wielding thug hesitated. He had watched too many of his crew go down in mere seconds, but fear made him reckless. He lunged, aiming the blade straight for Mike's ribs. Mike moved like lightning. He sidestepped, trapping the thug's arm with a vice-like grip. A second later, his elbow came down, hard, on the man's forearm. The biker howled in pain, the knife clattering to the ground. One by one, the so-called iron fangs were reduced to groaning bodies on the pavement. The few still standing exchanged nervous glances. The ones who could still move stumbled back toward their bikes, no longer looking for a fight, only an escape. Scarface, still on the ground, his face bloodied and swollen, looked up at Mike with a mix of hatred and fear. He tried to speak, but no words came out. Mike stared down at him, his expression unreadable. Then, finally, he spoke. "Should have left me alone." His voice was calm, unshaken, absolute. Scarface swallowed hard. The gang, battered and broken, scrambled onto their bikes. The roar of engines echoed through the street. But this time, it wasn't a sound of power. It was retreat. As the dust settled, the crowd that had gathered exploded into cheers. The food vendor shook his head in disbelief. "Man, that was unreal." Mike, still breathing steady as if nothing had happened, grabbed his hot dog from where he'd set it down earlier. He took another bite, chewing as if he hadn't just obliterated an entire gang. Then, finally, he turned back toward the crowd. Who's hungry? What happens next? Will Scarface dare to come back for revenge? Or has he just learned the biggest lesson of his life? Drop it in the comments if you want to see what happens next. Like this video if you love action-packed stories. Subscribe now and hit that bell, because trust me, this is just the beginning. The Iron Fangs were gone, their once dominant presence reduced to nothing more than a fading echo of revving engines in the distance. The street, which had been tense with the promise of violence just moments ago, settled into an eerie silence. But it wasn't over, not yet. Mike Tyson stood tall, his breath steady, his posture unshaken. Around him, the battered remnants of the gang still lay scattered on the pavement, some groaning in pain, others barely conscious. Scarface had been dragged onto the back of a bike by one of his men, his pride shattered, his body broken. But Mike knew the look he had seen in the biker's eyes before he fled. Hatred, humiliation, a thirst for revenge. The food vendor, still gripping his metal tongs as if they were some kind of weapon, let out a low whistle. "Man," he muttered, shaking his head, "you just did what the cops around here have been too scared to do for years." Mike took another bite of his hot dog, unfazed, chewing as if nothing had happened. It wasn't the first time trouble had found him, and it wouldn't be the last. But something still felt off. The people around him were still too stiff, too on edge. And then Mike heard it, the distant guttural roar of more motorcycles. His jaw clenched. They were coming back. The vendor's face paled as he heard it too. "Oh, hell no," he muttered, stepping back behind his cart like it was some kind of shield. The crowd, sensing danger, started to scatter. Mothers grabbed their children, shopkeepers retreated inside, and the street emptied out as quickly as it had filled. Mike turned, his eyes narrowing as he saw them appear at the end of the block. More of them this time. Scarface hadn't run away in shame. He had gone for backup. A dozen new bikers roared onto the street, their tires screeching as they came to a halt in a half-circle formation, effectively cutting off the block. They were bigger, meaner, better armed. Steel pipes, chains, knives, all glinting under the late afternoon sun. Scarface, still nursing his wounds, limped off his bike with murder in his eyes. He wiped the blood from his mouth, the swelling in his face making his snarl look even more grotesque. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life," he spat, his voice hoarse but dripping with venom. Mike exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders. He still wasn't worried. If anything, he looked bored. Scarface's second in command, a thick-necked brute with a spiked bat slung over his shoulder, took a step forward. "You think you're some kind of legend, huh?" he growled. "Well, let's see what happens when it's 13 against 1. Mike sighed. "Should have brought more." Scarface's face twisted with rage. "Get him!" The gang charged. Mike moved, and the real fight began. The moment Scarface shouted, the Iron Fangs surged forward like a pack of rabid wolves. Steel pipes, chains, and knives flashed under the setting sun, their crude weapons swinging through the air, aiming to crush, cut, and maim. The pavement shook with their charge, the roar of battle drowning out the last remnants of normal city life. But Mike Tyson, he was ready. The first thug, a brute with a spiked bat, swung wildly at Mike's head. Too slow. Mike slipped to the side, the bat whistling past his ear. Before the biker could recover, Mike's fist rocketed forward, shattering his ribs with a sickening crunch. The man's body folded like a chair, collapsing onto the pavement, gasping for air. The second came in fast, a chain whipping toward Mike's face, but Mike caught it midair, yanking the thug forward and sending a crushing knee into his gut. The man gagged, his grip on the chain loosening. Big mistake. Mike wrapped the chain around his forearm, and with one swift motion, swung it straight into another biker's face. Blood sprayed as the metal cracked against bone. More came. One with a knife. Mike dodged the first slash, grabbed the man's wrist, and snapped it with a brutal twist. The knife clattered to the ground as its owner screamed, cradling his broken arm. Another lunged with brass knuckles. Mike ducked the wild punch, countering with a devastating uppercut that lifted the biker off his feet before he slammed back onto the pavement. But they kept coming. A biker swung a steel pipe at Mike's knees, a dirty move. Mike didn't just dodge, he caught the pipe mid-swing. With the strength of a wrecking ball, he ripped it from the thug's grip and drove the end into his stomach, doubling him over. Then, with one explosive motion, Mike swung the pipe like a baseball bat. Crack! The biker flew sideways, crashing into a pile of garbage cans. Scarface watched, his confidence crumbling with every fallen man. His backup, the bikers he had sworn would end this fight, were getting torn apart. Mike, untouched, unshaken, exhaled through his nose, his fists still clenched. The last biker standing, the biggest of the crew, pulled a switchblade, desperation in his eyes. He charged. Mike let him come. The moment the blade slashed forward, Mike sidestepped with inhuman speed, caught the biker's wrist, and with a brutal snap, disarmed him. Before the man could even react, Mike spun and delivered a knockout right hook straight to his temple. The biker dropped, and just like that, it was over. Scarface, the last man standing, stumbled back, his face drained of color. He looked around. The gang he had brought to finish this fight? They were groaning, broken, scattered across the pavement. Mike locked eyes with him. Scarface swallowed. He had one last choice to make. Scarface stood frozen, his chest heaving, his knuckles clenched so tightly his nails dug into his palms. Around him, the iron fangs lay scattered and broken, some groaning, others barely moving. His backup, the men he had promised would tear Mike Tyson apart, had been taken down one by one. It wasn't supposed to go this way. He had never lost before. Not like this. Not in front of a crowd. Mike took one slow step forward, and Scarface instinctively flinched. The crowd saw it. They saw the once feared gang leader stumble back in fear. Mike tilted his head slightly, eyes locked on Scarface like a lion, deciding whether or not to finish the kill. His breathing was still calm, his body untouched, as if he had barely exerted himself. Scarface gritted his teeth, his pride burning hotter than the pain in his ribs. He couldn't let it end like this. His fingers inched toward his belt, reaching for the cold, hidden weight of his pistol. Mike saw it instantly. Before Scarface could even draw the weapon, Mike moved. A blur, a shadow, a storm. His hand shot forward, clamping around Scarface's wrist like an iron vise. With one brutal yank, he twisted. The gun was ripped from Scarface's grip and sent skidding across the pavement. Then came the punch. A single, earth-shattering right hook to Scarface's jaw. Crack. The impact was bone-crushing, sending Scarface's body twisting through the air before he crashed onto the ground, his back slamming into the pavement with a sickening thud. He didn't move. For a long moment, the street was silent. Then, a groan. Scarface rolled onto his side, his face swollen and bloodied, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His fingers scraped weakly against the concrete as he tried and failed to push himself up. Mike stood over him, looking down with the cold, calculating eyes of a man who had been here before. He had fought monsters in the ring. Scarface was nothing. "You brought a gun," Mike said, his voice low, steady, dangerous. Scarface coughed, spitting blood onto the pavement. His pride was shattered, his body wrecked, and for the first time in his life, he felt completely powerless. Mike leaned down, his voice a quiet storm. "You're done." Scarface swallowed hard. He knew it. His gang, what was left of them, knew it too. The men who were still conscious scrambled to their feet, dragging their injured brothers toward their bikes. No one wanted to fight anymore. Mike stood tall, his shadow looming over Scarface, like a final warning. "Next time," Mike said, turning to walk away, "don't come back." Scarface lay there, watching as Mike Tyson disappeared into the city. The king had spoken. In 2025, the world may have changed, but the core of the story remains timeless. Strength, resilience, and standing against injustice. In an era where conflicts escalate with a single post, where respect is often mistaken for weakness, Mike Tyson's lesson is more relevant than ever. He didn't just fight, he sent a message that true power lies not in intimidation, but in discipline, in control, in knowing when to strike and when to walk away. This wasn't just about a street fight. It was about standing tall when others try to tear you down. It was about facing those who abuse power and proving that fear has no place where true strength exists. Scarface, a relic of an old world mentality, thought force alone would make him untouchable. He learned the hard way that real warriors don't rely on numbers, weapons, or threats. The street was silent, save for the distant hum of traffic and the faint groans of the biker gang sprawled across the pavement. Scarface, once the feared leader of the Iron Fangs, lay on his back, staring up at the darkening sky, his mind reeling from the sheer brutality of what had just happened. Mike Tyson stood over him, calm, controlled, and completely untouched. His fists, still clenched, showed no signs of exhaustion, no indication that he had just taken down an entire gang with nothing but his bare hands. Scarface's pride burned hotter than the pain in his ribs. This wasn't just a beating, it was a humiliation, a message sent loud and clear for everyone to see. The Iron Fangs had ruled these streets for years, their reputation built on fear, intimidation, and unchecked violence. But tonight, all of that crumbled. The few remaining gang members who could still move were helping their fallen brothers limp toward their bikes, their hands shaking, their confidence shattered beyond repair. Scarface struggled to sit up, his jaw swollen, his lips split. The pain was unbearable, but the humiliation was worse. Mike didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His presence alone spoke volumes. Scarface clenched his fists, his breathing ragged. "You think this is over?" he spat, his voice hoarse from pain. His eyes still burning with hate, locked onto Mike's unflinching gaze. Mike didn't react. No smirk, no insult, no arrogance. Just that steady, measured stare that made it clear he wasn't afraid of Scarface. He never was. Scarface's hands trembled as he pushed himself to his feet, his legs barely holding him up. He knew what he had to do. Retreat, regroup, wait for the right time. But something in his gut told him there wouldn't be a next time. Tonight, the Iron Fangs weren't just beaten. They were erased. Their reputation reduced to nothing more than a ghost story, a cautionary tale about what happens when you pick a fight with the wrong man. Scarface swallowed his rage, wiping the blood from his mouth as he slowly turned away. The crowd, once terrified of him, now looked at him with something worse than fear: pity. With a final glance over his shoulder, he muttered under his breath, "This ain't over." Mike watched as the bikers mounted their motorcycles, engines growling as they sped off into the night, their once mighty presence now nothing more than fading echoes in the distance. The vendor let out a long, low whistle, shaking his head. "Damn, man, that was something else." Mike exhaled, rolling his shoulders, his body finally relaxing. Without a word, he reached for the half-eaten hot dog he had left on the counter, and just like that, he took another bite. Because for Mike Tyson, this was just another day. In 2025, the world may have changed, but the core of this story remains timeless: strength, resilience, and standing against injustice. In an era where conflicts escalate with a single post, where respect is often mistaken for weakness, Mike Tyson's lesson is more relevant than ever. He didn't just fight, he sent a message that true power lies not in intimidation but in discipline, in control, in knowing when to strike and when to walk away. This wasn't just about a street fight. It was about standing tall when others try to tear you down. It was about facing those who abuse power and proving that fear has no place where true strength exists. Scarface, a relic of an old world mentality, thought force alone would make him untouchable. He learned the hard way that real warriors don't rely on numbers, weapons, or threats. They rely on skill, on confidence, on knowing exactly who they are. The lesson for us? In life, we will all face our own Scarfaces, people who underestimate us, who try to push us down, who mistake kindness for weakness. But when the moment comes, will we stand our ground? Will we be ready, like Mike, to show them that we will not be broken? What's next for Mike Tyson? Should he walk away? Or will Scarface try again? Does the city now look to Mike as its protector? Or does his dominance invite even bigger challengers? Drop a punch in the comments and let us know. What would you do if you were in Mike's shoes? Hit like if you stand with Mike Tyson. Subscribe now, because this fight, it's far from over.